Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a utility box. Utility boxes are a really fun project that you can use for kitchenware items, as well as some jewelry boxes or other things around the house. I've got a few of these in my kitchen for salt, pepper, and some barbecue rubs, and they're really handy to have. Some of the different features that make these different from an end grain decorative box are going to be mostly or primarily is going to be the grain orientation. So the grain is going to be running this direction instead of a typical end grain box where you'd be running into end grain fibers. A couple other things is I want to have a one-handed operation for the lid. This just makes it more convenient when you're pulling things out of it, so you don't have to take it apart with like a traditional pressure fit lid. The other thing I want to make sure I have on this box is going to be a wide, stable base. When you have this on your kitchen table, you don't want it to be rocking or be able to tip over on you. So having a wide, stable base as well as a slightly thicker wall section on the box is going to be really handy to have. As far as the design and shape goes, you really can have tons of different styles. You can have shorter, squattier boxes, or you can go a little bit taller depending on what you want to have in them. For the material selection, I have some kiln-dried material here. These are roughly 4 to 5 inches in diameter, and then about 2.5 inches on the base. And then for the lid, I'll be doing a walnut top, and this is about a 2-inch thick piece that's 5 inch in diameter. The reason I'm going with a maple base and then a walnut lid is just for some contrast. I do like a maple box, solid maple, solid cherry, but I think the walnut lid will stand out a little bit better. So let's go ahead and start turning. I'll clear the lathe off and we can get to it. Alright, so to start turning the base of this box, I'm going to mount the base on a 3-in-1 screw chuck, and I've already pre-drilled this for the screw, so I'm going to go ahead and get this set on there. And lock that spindle down. And while we're putting this on there, just want to readdress the grain orientation. This is set up just like a bowl blank would be, so I have the grain orientation running this way through the blank. So we're basically turning what a lot of people call a lidded bowl, but it's a utility box. So we've got the grain orientation running this direction, so I've got end grain, side grain, and then end grain. Now that we're on here, I'm just going to double check that it's locked in. And I will be bringing up my tailstock for support, just in case, while we rough this down. Go ahead and get your safety glasses. I'm going to go ahead and clean these off. Alright, so I got my safety glasses on. I'm going to bring up my tool rest, make sure that the piece clears. And to rough this out, I'm going to be using this is a 1/2-inch bowl gouge, so 5/8 bar, 1/2-inch flute. Make sure this is clear, and when I start the lathe, I want to start with lathe speed low, and then bring it up. A piece this size, I'm going to be about 12 to 1300 RPM. It's fairly true. We cut it round on the bandsaw. If you were going to be turning a square blank, you'd want to start a little bit slower. But we'll go ahead and rough this down. I've got my flute fairly closed over. If I go in there with that flute straight up, it will catch on me. So make sure you start with that flute closed over. I'm going to go ahead and start truing this up. Obviously on any turning project, you want to make sure your tools are sharp. These ones I hit on the grinder right before we started. Okay, I'm going to grab my pencil and eyeball my overall dimension where I want to be. I want to try and match the size and shape of this finished box, so I'm going to reduce this diameter by about 1/2 inch to 5/8 from what we started out with. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the rest of that material. Once I get to the end here, these fibers are unsupported, so I want to slow the cut down and let those peel off. I'll show you real quick. If I try to take that cut too quickly, these fibers, because they're unsupported, they blow out. So you want to slow that cut down as soon as you get to that point. Again, slow down right there on the end, just lift the handle and let the tool do the work. Now that I'm close to my exterior size that I want to be at, I'm going to do one more cut, and I'm going to try and get this side nice and flat and then get a good clean cut. Alright, we're getting good ribbons, getting good curls. We should be getting a fairly clean surface here. Just the tiniest amount of torn grain right there. The end fibers blew out just a little bit. So now we can go ahead and establish our foot and the tenon on this piece that we'll be using to hold the piece when we flip it around. I'll true this face off. It should be fairly flat because it was off flat stock, but I'm going to go ahead and remove my tail stock here. I just want to true this up and make sure I've got a nice clean surface. Bring my tool up there and see where my cutting edge is. I need to bring the tool rest up just slightly. I'm going to turn this on and clean this up. To make this cut, I'm just going to be squeezing my hand to bring the tool towards me, and then I've got that flute totally closed over. If I go in there with that flute open, it will catch in really bad and get a pretty serious catch. But we just want to square this off and get it fairly close to flat. So as far as my tenon goes, I'll be using, this is a 4-inch chuck. It's a VM100 with 4-inch bowl jaws. So with these jaws completely closed, I'll go ahead and get my calipers, and I'll set this up, and then we can go ahead and mark our tenon. And I want the tenon to be slightly oversized from what our finished dimension is, because on our foot, I'm just going to have a nice small step on the foot here, and I want that tenon to be slightly larger than that because we will be compressing those fibers. We'll true up that surface later on. I just want to have enough material there, that way I don't get too small on my finished size. So as far as my calipers go, I drag with the lead leg here on the downward side and then bring it up until these lines touch. Never touch this end on the piece when it's coming up, or else it will catch on you. But that's going to be our mark for our foot. Go ahead and move that chuck out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and use my bowl gouge to establish the rough foot. And then to clean that up, I can come in here with my skew to establish that foot and that tenon. Or I can come in here with a spindle gouge, make sure that flute's completely closed. And that'll give me a really nice clean cut. Alright, so we can go ahead and take a look at our foot. So you can either use the skew or the spindle gouge, and that'll give you a nice good tenon there for your chuck to register on. So what we can do actually before we take that off, just go ahead and test fit the chuck. And so we've got about a 1/4 inch of gap in the chuck jaws, and that is going to be perfect. So that'll give us still plenty of room to reduce the size of that tenon once we finish the turning for our decorative foot, and this will give us a really good hold. Let's go ahead and take this off. Well, spindle. And then we can go ahead and take off our 3-in-1 screw chuck as well. Alright, go ahead and get the 3-in-1 screw chuck off the lathe. And then we can put our 4-jaw chuck. I'm going to go ahead and snug this up pretty good. You always want to tighten both pinion gears. Make sure you're really snug there. Now we can go ahead and start roughing this out. So just for reference, this is kind of the orientation we've got right now. We've got the chuck and the tenon like that. We're going to go ahead and rough out the inside of the bowl or the box here. Primarily we're going to be coring this out with a scraper. So you can use a bowl gouge to get some of that bulk material, but we're going to want to use a box scraper so we can have a nice straight wall and then a flat base on the inside. Before I start turning the inside, I want to just clean off the outside a little bit, and I'll be using a shear scraping cut here. Rotate that handle to the other side. So I'm going to be cutting on this wing here. I've got that flute rolled over to where we're just doing a nice light cut, and I've got the handle fairly low. I could have cleaned this up a little bit better before we flipped it around, but this will be just fine. The nice thing about that shear scraping cut is it gives you a really fine ribbon and a really good clean surface on a piece, especially if you're using timber that doesn't cut very cleanly or is hard to cut clean. You can see this maple has no tear out on it, and that shear scrape works really well. So let's go ahead and flip this around. We're going to face this off just to clean off this exterior, and then we're going to go ahead and start hollowing this out. Make sure that clears. Just like turning a bowl, make sure that flute is closed when you start. Otherwise the tool, if you have the flute open too far, that tool will skate on you. So you want that flute closed until you're on your bevel, and then you can go ahead and open that up a little bit. Make sure that flute's closed. Once you're on your bevel, rotate that flute open. And then you can go and make that cut. A lot of times we see guys will come in there with the flute open and then it just skates out on them. So make sure you're on your bevel, and then you can open up the flute. And make that cut. So once I've got some of that bulk material removed, I'm going to go ahead and get my scraper. This is a traditional box scraper here. It's got a slightly radius nose, that way I'm not engaging the entire cutting surface once I hit the bottom of the inside. And then I've got a cutting edge on this wing here. You can see this is ground away slightly to give me clearance on the inside of the box. I'm going to remove my revolving center and slide my tool rest out of the way just to give me a little more space to work. But we can go ahead in here and start making the cut. Looks like I need to raise up the tool rest just a hair. The nice thing is, because we are cutting with a bowl grain orientation where the side, we're hitting side grain now, it's not very aggressive compared to normal end grain box hollowing. Traditional scrapers on end grain box hollowing gets pretty aggressive, where this will cut very easily for us, and it'll actually give us a really clean surface. Whenever I'm scraping inside of a box, make sure you have your arm and your hand on top of the tool handle. That way you're not down here and the handle catches and snags you in the face. So make sure you have your hand on top of the tool, that way there's something to block it from coming up on you if you do have a little bit of a catch. I'm going to stop the lathe and just double check our depth. Just kind of see where we're at, just so we know. So we're about halfway in. So as far as the decorative foot goes, the foot's already there in the chuck jaws. I want to basically go down to about here. The nice thing about these utility boxes is you don't have to go ultra thin with them like you do decorative boxes. I don't want something that's super light and likely to get knocked over. That's why we're going with a larger foot. And I'm going to have just a little bit more weight in this piece. As far as our inner diameter, I'm going to mark that just about halfway from where we are right now. That's just a rough eyeball so I don't go past that mark. You can see there it kind of grabbed in there a little bit when I hit the bottom. That's why I keep my hand on top of the tool. You want to slow down as soon as you get to the bottom of the box because you'll be engaging more cutting surface and it'll tend to get a little grabby as soon as you hit the bottom. So once I know I'm close, I slow the cut down and then let it register off the bottom, and that way it's not digging in and getting aggressive on me. Let's go ahead and check our depth. All right, so we're about a 1/4 inch away from where we want to be. Now I want to go ahead and establish the recessed tenon here that the lid will fit into and our diameter. So it's pretty close to what we already have this mark here. So this is going to be the exterior, this will be the inside step, and that way I've just put a mark in there just so I don't go past that. I'm going to true up this edge and then go ahead and establish my step. And looking at this step, I'm not going to go very deep. This is about 1/8 of an inch recess. I'm going to keep that about the same because my lid thickness here is about 1/8 of an inch, and that's what we're going to shoot for on this piece. So let's go ahead and give ourselves the depth we need, and then we'll go ahead and clean up the interior walls here. The end grain, as they came around, tore out just a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and clean that up, and then we'll go ahead and sand and finish the inside. We're almost done. I'm shooting for a perfectly flat interior on the bottom. I think it looks really nice, but you could also go with a slightly curved dish bottom. That way all the spices kind of collect at the bottom and you're not trying to dig stuff out of the corners. But that's up to you, personal preference. Okay, I've established the bottom there, nice and flat. Go ahead and take a look and get our final measurement. You can see because we're hitting side grain in the bottom, it gives us a really good clean cut. Let's go ahead and double check our overall depth. So we're about 1/8 of an inch away. I think we're okay there. We could go, I'll do a couple more passes, just thin that out just a little bit more, and then we'll go ahead and clean up that torn grain on the walls there. Alright, so now I've got my depth fixed. I've got our overall depth totally done. Now I want to go ahead and clean up the torn grain on the inside. And what I'll do to do that is I'm going to grab some scratch free and just pack it in the side here. This will help lubricate the cut as well as stiffen up those end grain fibers and allow them to be cut cleanly. Alright, so now that we've got some wax in there, we should be able to get a good clean cut. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bump the lathe speed up slightly. Usually increasing the RPM will allow you to get a little better cut as well. So right now I'm at 1300, I'm going to bump this up to 16. And then I'm going to go for one more pass. Alright, stop the lathe and take a look and see how that surface is. Okay, it's definitely reduced the torn grain by a fair amount. I think we could do one more pass and then we'll be right there. If you're having some fibers that aren't cutting clean, we can go in there with a gouge and go and try and clean this up because we are supported by the bevel now. So we're getting ribbons now, we're not scraping, this is a good cut. Let's take a look at the end grain and see if it's cutting clean. Alright, so I can see where the bevel was contacting with just a little too much pressure. There's some ridges in there that'll sand out okay, and there's just very minimal torn grain now. So if you are having issues with the scraper tearing out the fibers too bad, go ahead and go to a gouge and cut it that way. On the other boxes I did, the scraper cut them pretty clean. I didn't have much sanding to do. So this is a good learning lesson. If you are having some timber that's hard to cut, we can go back to a gouge and get a cleaner cut that way. So now that we have our overall depth where we want it, I'm just going to double check this. Yeah, we're within 1/16 of where we want to be. That's going to be fine because I think I'll actually reduce some of this material on the back side. We've got a nice flat surface on the inside, cut clean. The walls are cut pretty well. This has some wax in it, but this shoulder is cut clean, and then this face. One thing I want to do on the face actually is have it slightly taper towards the inside. That way when you're centering the lid, it kind of helps find the center naturally. So for that, bring my tool rest back in, and I'll be using the scraper. And all I'm doing is making sure that this inside edge is a little bit tapered from the outside towards the inside to where it helps final the lid in place. Before we take this out of the chuck, we want to go ahead and sand and finish the inside of this because we'll be flipping it around. So I'm going to remove the tool rest, get that out of the way. And we can go ahead and start sanding. I'll be using the Ornate sanding screens. The reason I like to use these is they last a really long time and then they don't load up like traditional paper. So there's my 320, 240, and then I'm going to start sanding at 180. This torn grain should come out with the 180, but if you need to go a little coarser, go ahead. I'm going to drop the speed back down for sanding. The reason you drop the speed down is you don't want heat checking, as well as if you're going too fast, the sandpaper doesn't cut efficiently. It tends to just kind of skip over the surface, and it doesn't actually work very well. So we turn the speed down. The other nice thing about this Ornate is when it loads up, you can just flick it, and then it's a nice clean sheet of paper again. Don't spend too much time right in the center or else it'll wallow it out and you'll have a little dimple in there. And you want this to be a fairly clean surface on the inside. If you have any torn grain, it usually tends to collect those salt particles and whatever you're putting in the box, and it makes it look kind of trashy. So we want a nice clean surface on the inside of the piece. Let's take a look and see if we've got rid of that torn grain. There's just a hair left. The bottom looks good. I'm going to give it just a little more time sanding on the side of the wall, and then we can go ahead and bump up to our 240. Don't forget to sand the front face here, as well as that little tiny step. Be careful not to roll the edges that you have here. It looks nice when you have crisp, clean lines. Usually a lot of times the sandpaper will roll those and soften them too much, and it just doesn't look as good. Go ahead and jump up to our 240. If I didn't have that torn grain on the sidewalls, I probably could have started with 240 or 320. Just fold this over here. Just reduce the overall size of the paper. Now we can bump up to 320. The other nice thing about this paper is if you are wet sanding, it doesn't clog up like traditional paper, and it doesn't fall apart because it's cloth backed. Alright, and you don't have to, but I'm going to go ahead and hit this with 400 and 600. Just give it a quick once over with this stuff. Alright, so now that we've sanded it, I'm going to go ahead and grab my paper towel. And we'll hit this with a scratch free. And I'm going to be putting a fair amount of pressure on there because I want to work this wax into the surface and help polish that out and give me a really good surface for a finish. As far as my finish that I'm going to use on this piece, it'll be the tried and true original, and I'll be doing that off the lathe after the project's finished turned. That stuff's a food safe finish, and it takes a few days to go through the finishing process. So for now, I'm just going to be putting on scratch free. If you wanted to, you could do a beeswax finish. Just keep it all all natural on that end. Plus, beeswax has a really good smell. So go ahead and take a look at the inside. All the torn grain got removed. We've got a nice, good finish all around the surface, and I'm pretty happy with that. So now we can go ahead and flip this around. I'll be expanding using the chuck jaws into this recess. One thing that I've done is with this 4-inch chuck, I know I can fit into this recess. If you don't have this set of bowl jaws though, you can turn a jam chuck and jam chuck this on there. So that's your other option if you don't have the jaws that fit. So I'm just going to close these up all the way, and then I'll be expanding into this recess. And I don't want to get too tight on the chuck jaws. If I crank down on this, it will blow out those fibers and split the piece. So it's going to be tight enough to drive the piece, but I will be using the revolving center for the majority of the support. So I'm going to move my tools. And because we know where the depth of our piece was, it was just a little shy of this initial mark. So that's the actual depth there. What we're going to do is I'm going to remove this tenon completely, and then I'm going to step the foot down, our decorative foot, right about here. So that way we'll get rid of some of this excess material and weight, as well as the overall height. We'll just shorten it down just a little bit and make it look a little nicer. So bring up that tailstock, make sure you have adequate pressure on there. And now we're going to go ahead and true this exterior surface off. Make sure this is nice and flat, straight-sided as best you can. And we want to get a really clean surface to minimize sanding. And then we'll go ahead and sneak up on our fit this way. Make sure everything clears. When I true up the exterior surface, I'm going to be using an Irish grind bowl gouge. This gives me a really long wing to shear scrape with. It doesn't remove a lot of material, but it gives me a really clean surface. So we can go ahead and bring our speed back up. I've got that handle really low and I'm cutting on this wing here with the flute really closed over. So depending on your tool rest, if you have any marks or nicks in it, your tool might drag as you're trying to go across, and I want to be fairly smooth here. So if that is happening, go ahead and true up your tool rest. You can sand it down a little bit or file it if you need. But that's looking pretty good. I've got a little bit of a high spot right there. I've got a nick in my tool rest. I keep digging in right here, but I think that looks pretty solid. Let's go ahead and take a look at the grain. It's cutting very cleanly, so now I'm going to go ahead and reestablish my depth lines. And then we can go ahead and remove this material. So I've got that flute closed. And we're just removing the bulk of the foot. And to give myself a nice, really clean foot here, I'm going to be using my spindle gouge. This will allow me the access I need to give myself a clean angle. If you don't want to use a spindle gouge, you can go ahead and use your skew. So there's the option there with the spindle gouge, or you can come in here. I'm going to adjust the tool rest slightly. Come in here with my skew, negative rake scraper. Need to angle my tool rest slightly. So that's going to be my overall foot diameter. It gives me a nice little step in there to raise that off. And I've got a really good clean cut here. Go ahead and use my my bowl gouge here to finish removing that bulk. Alright, so let's talk about the foot design real quick. I want this to be slightly concave, and then I'm going to be putting a couple decorative bands in the bottom. It just makes it look a little bit nicer, as well as that concave foot here reduces some of the weight. But you can see that skew gave us a really good clean shoulder in there. That looks really nice. And so we can go ahead and just remove some of that material. If you want to, you can go ahead and use your skew to get in there. A nice radius skew will help you get that nice radius concave foot. And bring that tool rest up just a touch. That skew is a fair amount thinner than the bowl gouge. Alright, now should be leaving us a nice clean surface. Alright, so we've got a really good clean cut here. The decorative foot looks pretty nice. I'm going to go ahead and just smooth that out just a touch. And then I like to chamfer these ends just a touch. I don't like having really sharp edges on these pieces. A lot of times if your hand bumps into them and they're sharp, they'll cut you open pretty good. So now with the tailstock still in place, I want to angle my tool rest. Not like that, actually. I need to give myself a little bit of clearance, so I loosened the locking lever on the tool rest and then the locking lever up top, and then I extended it out, give myself some clearance. So bring your tool rest in, and I'm going to be using my spindle gouge to pare this down as much as possible. And with this nub being reduced to a really small diameter here, I can stop the lathe, remove my tool rest, my tailstock, and then just snap that off. Because of the grain orientation, that'll break really cleanly because we're not breaking end grain fibers. And now I can use my skew to finish that off. Remember, I've got a very gentle hold up here with the chuck jaws because we are expanding into a fairly thin wall section. I don't want to do any heavy cutting now that the tailstock's out of the way. So I'll be using my skew just to gently ease this away, and then we can go ahead and sand and finish the foot. If you're ever turning and your hold isn't 100% sure and it's a little sketchy, go ahead and just keep your head out of the way just in case this does pop out. It'll fly, out of the way and won't hit me in the face. I have had it where I've at this point before and I had such a delicate hold on the piece, it just popped out. And unfortunately, because you're out of the way, you should be fine. The other thing too is if you're making a cut and it's making a lot of noise or flexing noise or chatter, chances are the wood doesn't like what's going on and it might pop out of the chuck on you. So make sure you have your headphones out and you can hear for that as well. But I just want to reduce this nub so we can go ahead and sand it. For this nub here, do not use the regular scraper, it's going to be too aggressive. Alright. So you can see we've got a really clean foot here. I think there's still just a little bit of a nub. I might remove some more material. But this is cut nice and clean. The exterior is cut clean, so we can go ahead and sand that after I remove that nub just a little bit more. It's one of those things where it's hard to tell unless you rub your hand against it and you can feel there's a high or a low spot. Just working from the center and drawing out. I don't want to spend too much time in any one particular place or you'll get yourself a low spot. Alright, that's ready to sand now. And with this side being a lot cleaner, where I don't have the torn grain on the inside, I'm going to start with 320. Make sure you're using a good respirator, your dust collector's going when you're sanding. I'm not using one just because of the audio we need to pick up. I will be adding some decorative lines, and I don't want to do it yet until the sanding's complete. I want these decorative lines to be nice and crisp, so I'll do that at the very end after I'm done sanding. All right, I'm going to go on to the 400 and 600. All right, so I moved on to the 600 grit just for good measure. All right, now we can go ahead and throw on our scratch free. I'm doing a fairly liberal coat here because I want enough of the abrasive paste to help burnish the surface and give me a really good surface for a finish. All right, now we can go ahead and take a look. That looks nice and sharp. I've got just a tiny amount of torn grain right here, so what I'm going to do, now that I have wax on the surface, I'm actually going to get my spindle gouge and just give me one more pass just to clean that up. Whenever you put finish on a piece, it really accentuates good grain, good clean cuts, as well as really bad cuts. So if you have any torn grain, it really makes it pop. Because I had that on a bevel writing cut, all the fibers were supported, so we should have a nice clean surface, as well as I had the wax on there that would help cut it clean. That's perfect. All those end grain fibers are cut nice and clean. I'll rotate that around so you can take a look. So now we're ready to go ahead and put our decorative lines in. Just a little low. I'm going to be using my skew, just the lead edge. And they're not very deep. The other thing too is with the decorative lines, only do 2 lines. If you do 3, it starts to look like a bullseye, as well as it gives 2 rings that have to be perfectly spaced out, and your eye is really drawn to them if they're not perfectly spaced. Whereas 2, it can be an arbitrary distance between the 2 lines, and it looks sharp. As well as it helps give you something to do your signature on and border it a little better. But the base is ready to come out. So we've got a really clean cut, nice cuts all the way around, clean surface, and we've got a nice open box for plenty of spices and salt and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and turn our lid, but for right now, the base is done. All right, now it's time to turn the lid. So now I've got my walnut piece here, and I'm going to mount this in between my 4-prong drive center and my revolving center. And you can mount that 4-prong directly in your chuck jaws. And then I have a center point on this piece, so I'm going to mount that on the 4-prong drive. And then I'll bring up my tailstock. So I can see my blank slightly crooked, so I'm going to move the tailstock back just a little bit. and then adjust that center point, and then give it a quick spin. And if everything's running fairly parallel, that's close enough for what we need here. So go ahead and tighten your tailstock down, and then we'll get our tool rest into position. Make sure everything clears okay, and what we're going to do now is just true up the exterior surface, and then we're going to go ahead and turn the inside of the lid here. So we're going to turn a decorative tenon that we can mount onto to turn the outside, but we want to have a nice clean face here, and then we want to establish our final outside diameter so we can test fit the lid. So give that a quick spin, make sure everything clears, and then we're going to go ahead and turn our lathe on. Make sure the lathe speed starts a little slow because this is a little out of round. And then you can bring your lathe speed up. So we're at about 1600 RPM, and I'm going to go ahead and use my bowl gouge now to true up the surface. I need to raise up my tool rest just a hair. And one thing I also need to mention is the walnut does have an allergic reaction to some people, so if you are allergic to walnut, or you know if you have any respiratory issues, make sure you wear a good dust mask. Again, I want to make sure I slow down on the end here because those end grain fibers will blow out there because they're unsupported. Just slow the cut down as soon as you get to the edge. That feels fairly close. I think I've got a small void right here we can go ahead and take a look at. There's a little bit of a knot there, so that will give you a false surface there. But that looks pretty clean. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself one more pass. I think by the time we get to our final diameter, we'll actually get rid of that knot, so it's not going to be an issue. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and adjust my tool rest now. I want to create a tenon that we can go ahead and mount in our chuck. And my tenon will be for these 4-inch bowl jaws, so go ahead and size your tenon to fit your chuck. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to my spindle gouge to give myself a little more clearance for that tenon. I'm going to adjust my tool rest in just a little bit now that I've got some room, and then I'll use my skew to clean up that dovetail. I think my skew is a little dull. I'm going to go ahead and hit the grinder real quick. Alright, now I just touched up my skew on the grinder to give myself a fresh edge. I'm going to go ahead and raise that up just because it's a little bit thinner than the bowl gouge. And let's clean up our dovetail here. We want a good surface for our chuck jaws to mount. And that looks pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and true up this end surface here with my bowl gouge. Alright, so I just chamfered the corner. I don't like having sharp edges on my pieces. A lot of times you'll bump into them, they'll give you a small cut there. So go ahead and chamfer any of those sharp edges if you have them. But now we can go ahead and remove that from the lathe. We're going to take our 4-prong drive out of the chuck. That goes back in our tool caddy. And then this we can mount in our chuck using that tenon. And I've sized that tenon pretty good there. I've got about 1/8 of an inch gap in my chuck jaws, so we're pretty close to a perfect circle. And make sure you tighten up both those pinion gears. Alright, so now I can move my tailstock out of the way. And the next step is going to be facing this off, and then we'll be turning that small tenon for our 2.5-inch chuck. I'm going to have a flat surface here, and then we're going to get our overall diameter and get that to a finished surface and test fit it in the base. So bring up your tool rest. I'm going to drop that back down because we had it set for the skew. Now for my bowl gouge, I want to make sure my height is right. I want that left wing here to be basically right at center when the flute's closed. So make sure you go ahead and give that a spin. We can turn our lathe back on. So I've got my flute closed. I'm going to go ahead and true up this surface. Make sure that flute's closed over when you start the cut. If you go in there with an open flute, it'll catch on you. So just be careful. Still just a little bit out of true. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and mark for my chuck jaws. My 2.5-inch dovetail jaws, that's gonna be right about the perfect size I need for my tenon. Depending on your chuck jaws you're using, go ahead and size them to fit your lathe. And now we can go ahead and remove that material so we can have our tenon. If you're not using calipers to check, you can move your tool rest out of the way and just give it a quick eyeball with your chuck jaws. So these are my 2.5-inch dovetail jaws. I'm just going to close those up a little ways. All right, so I've got about a 3/8 gap in my chuck jaws, so we've got plenty of room there. So now I'm going to go ahead and start shaping my tenon. I'm going to reduce the diameter just a little bit because those jaws were a little more open than I'd like. I want to get those as close to a perfect circle because it'll prevent the tenon from being crushed by the corners of the chuck jaws. All right, I'm going to start the lathe back up again. And I'm going to remove some material here just to expose a little more of a tenon. All right, and I'm going to use my 3/8 spindle gouge to start profiling the tenon, getting the radius I want. I don't want it to look like a traditional tenon. I want it to be slightly rounded, so it looks more like a decorative bead. We'll also use our skew to give us a slight radius. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I'll use my sandpaper to just roll that bead just a little smoother, but now I can go ahead and get my overall diameter of the lid. So I'm just gonna eyeball this. You can use your calipers, but I'd say we're pretty close to there, and that'll give me a good starting point. All right, I'm going to hold this up and see where our fit is. So we're about 1/8 of an inch larger than the outside diameter, so that gives us a good reference point. I'm going to go ahead and mark myself a new line. Calipers would be a pretty quick way to do it. You can set them to the exact size and then sneak up on the fit. Okay, so now that we're about to our diameter we need to fit inside the recess, I'm going to remove the bulk material and get ourselves just some more clearance to sneak up on our final size. So I'm going to adjust that because we're going to be working on the outside edge now. Remember, start with your flute closed. As you're getting down to your final size, be aware of where your chuck jaws are in relation to the wood. If I continued that cut right now, I'd go right into my chuck jaws, so that's why I stopped right here. Just be mindful of that. A lot of times it's easy to just kind of get focused on removing material, and next thing you know, you hit your chuck jaws. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna shear scrape towards the tailstock to get my final size, and that'll leave me a really fine edge, or a really clean cut here. So I'm gonna go and adjust my tool rest locking handle out of the way, and then I'm going to roll my flute closed, and I'm going to be cutting on this front wing. The nice thing about this is it is a shear scrape, so you get a really good surface. One thing you want to make sure you do is make sure the tool is sharp. If it's dull, it isn't going to cut very well for you. But you can see that surface is really clean compared to the cut we had before. So let's go ahead and test fit this. That's almost dropping in there, so we're very, very close. I'd say we're about a 64th of an inch away. I had some torn fibers there, I just wanted to clean those up. All right, we are almost there. I think one or two more cuts and we'll be right there. So right now my shear scrape is breaking out these fibers. It wasn't doing it on the maple before, so because I am having this tear out just a little bit, I'll leave myself some extra material on the face of this that I can cut back a little bit and get rid of those torn fibers. But the biggest thing is I want to make sure my shear cut leaves the end grain fibers right here on this face nice and clean. If you overturn this and the lid is too loose for the fit that you want, finish the lid out and then just stash it aside and then turn a new base for it later. I'm going to go ahead and check my fit one more time. It's starting to fit in, but it's just a little bit snug, so I'm going to open that up just a little bit more. All right, I think I've got my fit. Now I'm going to clean up this face. Just get rid of those torn fibers. All right, that's perfect. So it fits on there, and it's tight enough that this will actually stay on there. I'm going to leave that fit right there for now, and I'm going to finish that out once we flip the lid around. But for right now, that's exactly where I want it. I've established my fit, and the fit is good. It's tighter than what I'll want when it's finished. But once we flip it around, we're going to sand and do the lid and the knob and everything. So leave that surface the way it is and focus on cleaning up this surface here and then getting our tenon to exactly where we want it. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate my tool rest back around. I'm going to clean up this surface here, and then I'm going to concave the underside of the lid and give ourselves some decorative grooves. I'm going to get in here a little bit with my skew. I need to bring that tool rest up again. All right, that tenon's right where I want it now. I'm going to go ahead and concave the lid. Need to drop my rest back down. The biggest reason I concave the lid is just to remove some weight in the lid, as well as it looks a little more decorative. Just a little more aesthetically pleasing. Now that I've got the bulk out of the way, I'm going to use my skew just to smooth the curve out. Because my skew doesn't have a tight enough radius on the curve of the blade, I'm going to go to my regular scraper. I'm going to bring the handle out here. This has a little bit tighter radius, and that's what we'll be using to scrape this. Alright, now that surface looks pretty good. Let's stop the lathe and take a look. Okay, everything's cut cleanly. We've got our outside diameter established. The tenon's good. I've got just a couple torn fibers there, but those will sand out fine. So let's go ahead and sand this, and then we'll put some scratch free on. Alright, I'm going to drop my speed down to sand. Whenever you're sanding, obviously use a respirator, especially with walnut. Walnut's a pretty nasty wood to sand. Just using the corner of the paper to refine the curve I have on my tenon. That, and I'm trying to get in there a little bit to sand that surface. I'm just going to soften up this edge there just a little bit. It is kind of sharp. Now we can go ahead and move on. Again, we drop that speed down to help that sandpaper cut efficiently. You sand too fast, the abrasive will melt off the paper. And it'll destroy your sandpaper pretty fast, especially on discs where you're using hook and loop. I'm not too worried about sanding the exterior here because we will be getting that to our final size once we flip the lid around. So I'm not going to spend too much time sanding that right now. All right, I'm going to bump my speed back up. Using our scratch free. Scratch free makes walnut look extremely good. It refines that surface because of the microfine abrasive paste and just makes that surface really pop. Take a look at how good that walnut looks. So we've got clean cut surface, we've got a good decorative tenon here. I'm going to add my decorative grooves to match the base, and then we'll go ahead and flip this around. I'll be using the skew for the grooves. Again, like we talked about, we do the grooves after we sand. That way that detail stays nice and crisp. Anytime you put grooves in and then you sand them, it dulls them out and it makes them look not very good. And then go ahead and hit those grooves with some scratch free. Alright, so that's a really good surface we've got there. Go ahead and remove this chuck, and we're going to swap it out for our 2.5 inch jaws. So now we're going to go ahead and mount this on that decorative tenon. And when I tighten the jaws down, I don't want to get too crazy on the pressure. I want to get just hand tight. If I get any tighter than that, like I normally would be, I'm going to be crushing those fibers, and it's going to leave marks from the corners and the jaws. So I've got a decent hold here, but we're going to be relying mostly on the tailstock for the support. So now, just for your reference, this is how the piece is in the chuck. We've got it in the decorative tenon. Now we can go ahead and turn, either an OG curve with the knob, or you can go with something more of just a traditional rounded top with a regular knob. So play around with the different styles. You could go with a beaded lid. You could add some cool coves in there, some fillets and everything. Play around with the design. All right, I'm going to set up my tool rest now. And the nice thing is, doing it this orientation, we've already test fit the lid so we know it fits. All we're going to be doing is sanding that to give us a final surface, and that'll reduce the diameter and give us that good one-handed fit we're looking for. We're going to be removing most of the material here, so we'll be using our bowl gouge for that. Go ahead and make sure that everything clears before you start the lathe. And because we just remounted this, I'm going to start the speed fairly low. And then we'll bring the speed up and make sure everything's in there secure. All right, we're back at our turning speed, about 1600 RPM. And because we are on a decorative tenon now, I want to be fairly easy on my cuts. I don't want to cause a lot of stress to that tenon because it's a finished surface now. As I'm roughing this out, I'm going to set the depth of my lid, and that's about 1/8 of an inch. That's going to be the height of my lid at the max. And then I'm going to set my diameter for the knob. That's going to be right about there. I'm not focused on the dimension of it now. This is just a rough guideline of where I'm looking to be. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my tool rest in. Again, make sure that flute's rolled over when you start the cut, that way it doesn't catch on you. Alright, I'm going to go hit the grinder real quick. I can tell the edge has gone off this wing of the tool. So I'll be right back. Alright, so I just hit the grinder and gave myself a fresh edge. Now I'm going to establish the final curve that I'd like. And based on the length of the knob here, I'm going to remove about 1/4 inch of material. I think with the shorter base, I think it'll give it a little better look. So let's go ahead and finish up our shape. Yeah, I can tell straight away just after touching that up on the grinder, it takes a lot less pressure to make the cut. The shavings are just coming off with ease. I'm just rolling that radius around until I'm hitting my pencil mark. And now I'm going to go ahead and shear scrape the surface. Alright, that surface is pretty good. Now we can go ahead and start working on our knob shape. Alright, this tool's getting just a little too bulky for the curves that we need to get. So I'm going to bring my tool rest in, and I'll be using a 1/2-inch spindle gouge to make these cuts now. If you need to, if you're having a hard time controlling that spindle gouge, go ahead and use your skew. On big sweeping curves like this, the skew is a great tool to have because it allows you to focus on making the curve you need and not so much the tool technique. I'm going to bring up my tool rest just a little bit. The other nice thing is because it has that long point on there, I can get down in there where those two curves meet, where I'd have a hard time otherwise with these bowl gouges. Just working on refining the curve of that knob we have there. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at the surface we have behind. It's about time to remove the tailstock, so I want to make sure I don't have to do any more heavy cutting on this face here. I want to be fairly gentle once we get the tailstock out of the way. So that surface looks good. There's some tool marks on there from the bevel writing, but as far as the grain goes, everything's cut cleanly. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish the curve on the top of the knob. I'm going to remove the tailstock, and then we'll be able to sand. I need to drop that tool rest down. I was just a little bit above center and it wasn't cutting very well. I'm just going to refine this radius as well as get rid of that center point from the tailstock. So right now I have enough material to cut that away and get rid of that dimple, but if you didn't have enough material to do that, you could try and incorporate that into the design. So you could give yourself a little bit of a depression there, try and make that look like a decorative feature. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So if you have a dimple that's just stubborn and you don't have enough material to cut it away, you can radius that down and give yourself a nice little decorative knob on top. So I still have a little bit of that dimple in the way. I'm going to go ahead and move my tailstock just a little further back. And accentuate that curve just a little bit more. And I'm just using the tip of the skew to get down in there. If you need to, you can go. I think that spindle gouge is going to be just a hair too big still. Keep using the point. There we go. And now I can refine my surface right here. So now if I get this out of the way and we stop the lathe. So now where we had that dimple from the tailstock, now this is an intentional design feature. We've got a nice radius flowing to a center here, and I think that looks pretty sharp. So the surface looks nice and clean. As far as the knob overall diameter, I don't want to go any smaller than this because the grain fiber orientation is going to be more prone to splitting off if this is too small. It doesn't have the strength of an end grain finial. So I'm going to leave the diameter there. I think that looked pretty sharp. And now we can go ahead and sand this and finish the exterior, and then our lid is done. All right, now that we have our surface turned, I can go ahead and sand the exterior here. Oh yeah, I forgot to drop my speed down. If you had a foam sanding block, that would be a really great place for this right now, because that would help you maintain that nice smooth curve. Anytime you're using your fingers to sand, each one of those has different pressure points, and it'll leave different marks on the piece. Especially on a piece like ash where you have hard and soft fibers, you'll have a really wavy surface. So sanding blocks are handy. Use them if you have them. I'm going to use my sandpaper to just help refine this curve I have on the knob and on the inside edge here. Make sure you fold up your paper and get down into that corner. And then I'm going to be using the lead edge of that paper just to get down into that little decorative groove we have there. You want to make sure you take your time sanding on the lid, because that's going to be the surface that people see first. If you have any torn grain on the top of your lid, that's going to be the first thing people notice. So make sure you take your time and do a good job. Again, the nice thing about this paper is if it gets loaded up at all, you just flick it or blow it out with a dust compressor, an air compressor, a dust compressor. Blow it out with your air compressor, and then it's good to go. Alright, last grid is 600, then we'll go ahead and hit this with scratch free. Traditionally, I always sand through 600. I've found 320 is just a little bit coarser than what I want to finish with. That's kind of up to you. A lot of turners will stop at 240 or 320. I like to go a little finer than that. To me, it's worth the extra time. Especially on a piece of wood that's really pretty like this walnut. I want to do the wood justice and really give that a good surface to make the grain pop. So now that I've got my scratch free, I'm going to go ahead and bump my speed back up. And you can see that color just popping out now with the scratch free on there. Walnut is one of my favorite woods to work with. Even though the dust and the smell of it's pretty nasty, the color of it is just so rich and just vibrant. It has a really high-end look to it. Especially Claro. If you can get some good figured Claro walnut, it's one of the best woods to turn. Or at least my favorite anyway. Alright, stop the lathe and we'll take a look. Yeah, look at the striking grain pattern we have on here. Very pretty. The surface is cut really clean. Let's go ahead and take it out of the chuck and I can show you guys. Alright, so that is the lid, and the lid is complete. Let's go ahead and test fit that with the base. That is perfect. So as far as the fit goes, there's just a hair of slop there to where it's a one-handed fit. But look at the beautiful contrast we have between the rich maple and the nice black walnut. That's a really pretty box, and that would look good on almost any counter. As far as my final finish goes, I'll be using tried and true. I'll be wiping this on off the lathe. But that is the box, and it's ready to go. When you guys turn some of these, go ahead and tag us on social media. But I hope you guys have fun and get out to the lathe and try turning one of these utility boxes.